Worldwide, cardiovascular disease affects the lives of hundreds of millions. Dedicated CardioNerds everywhere are working hard to fight this global epidemic. These are their stories.
Welcome back, CardioNerds. It's Amit Goyal. Thanks for joining us for this incredible series, The Braunwald Chronicles, where we hear about tales of discovery, innovation, and pivotal moments in the story of cardiology. Today, we're in for a real treat as we hear one of my personal favorite stories in this episode, Chapter 4, A Royal Screw-Up and the Discovery of Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy. There are hypertrophic cardiomyopathy centers of excellence sprinkled throughout the world. There are comprehensive ACC/AHA guidelines for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that came out in 2020. There's incredible drug discovery and randomized controlled trials looking at innovations in the management of HCM. We had a whole series on CardioNerds for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, where we taught about the 4 Ps or 4 preventions of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy management. Prevent symptoms, prevent stroke and atrial fibrillation, prevent sudden cardiac death in the patient, and prevent sudden cardiac death in the family. Well, today we get to hear all about how hypertrophic cardiomyopathy was discovered.
As we take in this breathtaking series, please remember that CardioNerds is an independent, fellow-founded platform with the goal to democratize cardiovascular education. You can support the mission by subscribing to and rating the show, donating via Patreon, getting CardioNerds swag on Teespring, and sharing your love for cardiology on social media. This podcast is not meant to be used for medical advice, and the views expressed here do not necessarily reflect the opinions or policies of our employers.
Dr. Braunwald, I'd like to take you back to what you just mentioned there, another part of your life and another lab. You mentioned the HCM story, and all our listeners and all of us here would love to hear that. Reading Thomas Lee's book, he mentions this moment where Dr. Morrow called you to the OR, I believe in 1958, and said, there's a terrible screw up here. I've opened this guy's heart and I just can't find anything wrong with it. And now this was someone that had been sent to surgery after you had analyzed his pressure tracings and concluded that aortic stenosis, but due to the location of the obstruction of the tracings, you determined him to have congenital subaortic stenosis.
Yeah.
This ends up being the prelude to the characterization, diagnosis, treatment of HCM. I was just in clinic the other day, and your teachings on this are exactly how we treated the patient. Can you tell us how the story unfolded?
Well, I'm in the cath lab. So this is the period, 58. I'm in the cath lab, director of the cath lab. I'm not yet chief of cardiology. That came at the 61. I'm doing the procedure. The phone rings. The nurse picks up the phone. She says, Dr. Morrow wants you in the operating room right away. I said to the nurse, I said, please tell Dr. Morrow I'm in the middle of a procedure. She says, he wants you up there right away. So he's still my boss. Okay, so I asked the fellow to finish the procedure. I go upstairs. Now, in 58, open heart surgery is a big, big deal. It was at the time we did the atrial septal defect, but now it's beginning to settle down. So what we thought, that this young man, in his early 20s, the loud, rasping aortic murmur, had a subaortic gradient. And all we could think of was a rare anomaly, which was congenital membranous subaortic stenosis. So Glenn and I went over the case, and he also reviewed the tracing, so it wasn't all my fault. I reminded him of that. So anyway, he reads up on this, and he says this should be easy, because it's just a matter of opening, doing an aortotomy, and excising that membrane. I can do that. I get up to the OR, and it was sort of a circus. There are people, there are pump technicians, a gaggle of anesthesiologists, many, surgical assistants. It's a big deal. It's like we would have thought of a moonshot. It was still that primitive. He said, "You screwed up. You really screwed up. There is no obstruction." I said, "I'm still calling him Dr. Morrow. I'm not calling him Glenn." I said, "Dr. Morrow, well," he said, "look," he said, "see, I can't fathom. I'm so nervous, excited, upset about it. I can't find any words." So he said, "Let me show you." He puts his finger through the aortic orifice. He has his assistant make an opening in the left atrium. And the two fingers meet. He does what you would consider a bimanual examination of the heart. And he had pretty thick fingers. "There is no obstruction here." He said, "We're going to have trouble getting him off the pump, because in those days, if you didn't fix the heart, they also arrested the heart with potassium citrate. It was very hard to get it going, and I just don't know what to say. There is no obstruction." So I said, "Yeah, I can't say I'm sorry," but I leave, and I'm sort of walking out with my tail between my legs. And I said, "If you can restart the heart, please, Dr. Morrow, stick a needle in the left ventricle and measure the pressure." He had a radial arterial thing. And he grumbled something like, "It's not going to do anything." So I go down, and I'm very depressed. I mean, this is going to be a young man dying because I screwed up on the measuring the tracing. And, that could be a career-ending mistake. There are certain mistakes that you just don't make. And I called my mother. I didn't call my wife. I called my mother. And she said, "It's going to be okay." She serves me chicken broth. "It's going to be okay." I said, "Well, I'm going to be fired." She says, "They're lucky to have you." And anyway, so I'm feeling a little better. I'm sitting there just thinking about how the mistake could be made. All of a sudden, Glenn Morrow comes in. He comes down and he sits next to me. He puts his arm not around me, but he taps me on the shoulder. He said he had a gradient of 90 millimeters of mercury when I stuck his left ventricle. And he said, he's in the recovery room. He's going to be okay. So, and he apologizes for having lost his cool. And of course, we have to understand how he could have lost his cool given this incredible circumstance. So the next thing I do is, we're all smiles, we're all happy with each other. Our relationship is intact. If anything, it's even stronger than it was before. I run to the recovery room, and he's got lots of bandages and so on. I can hear that murmur rasping away. I said, "What the hell is going on?" So this was a period when I would have contact with Glenn. I'm running the cath lab, and it was mainly for surgical patients, pre-op or diagnostic. And we would talk about this case like every other day. And after about a month, and we're not getting anywhere, just can't figure out how you can have obstruction and not have anything that does the obstruction. Although he did say that, he says this boy has a big heart. But there's, he did his bimanual exam. So he says to me around 4 to 6 weeks after the event, he said, "Gene, I've been in medicine much longer than you." He was 34, I was 28, something like that. I said, "Yes, I realize that." He said, "In medicine, there are sometimes you come across things that you simply can't explain. And, we can go around in circles forever. There are lots of other things that challenge us. I think we should drop this. And I said, okay. And that's where we left it until 2 days later. 2 days later, the whole thing repeats itself. Exactly the same thing. Well, so we knew there was something up. So we brought both of these, and it was also a young man. We brought both of them back and did angios and saw the bulge of the interventricular septum. And so we knew we had something big. And we got on top of that. And these patients had not been discovered because people weren't operating on aortic stenosis or subaortic stenosis. It was new, and therefore this brought along unearthed a lot of things. Although, of course, when I studied the ancient literature, there were some French cardiologists who had seen this in the 19th century, and there was a British surgeon, and Glenn sent him our paper, and he said, well, I've got one just like this, Lord Russell Brock. And so the thing took up. But what we did is within a year, we had a dozen cases. 3 of them were siblings. So we knew there was an autosomal dominant. And then we looked at the dynamics. As I mentioned, we looked at the fact that sometimes you'd catheterize them one day and there would be a gradient of 80, and catheterize them the next day, there was a gradient of 20. So something is going on. And we gave them isoprel, which increased the obstruction. And I came back with a beta blocker that I just described in this sad story about missing beta blockade in heart failure. And it's, and it proved to be reasonably useful and so forth. And that was the birth of HCM. Again, an accident. And I guess we were lucky that there was a second accident, because if we hadn't gotten that second case, then somebody else, it's not that it wasn't discoverable, then somebody else would have. The people in Toronto were very close on our heels, and they did a wonderful job. Doug Weigel was chief of cardiology there, good friend.
Dr. Braunwald, this is one of our favorite stories. And at Hopkins, Dr. Ed Casper tells it every single year to the cardiology fellows. And it's just incredibly inspiring. And in fact, we had him on the podcast to talk about the story as well, just because we just needed to get it out there. It really highlights a multidisciplinary approach, physical exam, trusting your gut, particularly in an era without echo or MRI, and real perseverance to figure out what is going on with this patient. And I know personally, several of my co-fellows think of the story very much when things just don't fit, but they know something's wrong. It's really amazing.
Yeah.
Dr. Braunwald, looking back at your time at the NIH overall, you described that your time there so vividly. The excitement and, the energy in the walls is palpable, the way you tell your stories of your time there. What would you say are the most valuable lessons that you learned, and how did that influence your future positions?
Wow, now you can see why this was one of my favorite stories. Be sure to join us for the next episode for another favorite story, Chapter 5, Carotid Sinus Stimulation, Limitation of Infarct Size, and the Open Artery Hypothesis. It's a story that gave birth to my chosen subspecialty of interventional cardiology. See you soon.